Welcome to Chapter 6, which is the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500. Your book talks quite a bit about what's going on in the world during these times, and in a particular part of the world, too. Basically, there's a decline in the kind of system that we saw in the last chapter with nobles, knights, and feudalism. And now there's a new organization, and the landowners or the kings, you can see here, they're collecting money from the people that are living on their lands. And they're using these funds to offer the citizens some protection, and they're expanding their kingdoms and monetizing things. So instead of peasants living on the land and just giving food or whatever they can make, they have to actually give money or something that the king can trade to make money for. And the people who live in the land, they're on the king's land, and so they're paying rent. And sometimes, they're not trading as much as they'd like, and sometimes they do have to trade goods, but the kings are looking for cash. And they would collect this money to build armies, and they started paying their militia. And they realized that they were getting a lot better results from paying people. Also, gunpowder was developed during this time, so the way warfare was conducted changed quite a bit. As there was more trade and more business people earning more money, there was another class, which we'll talk about later, which made more of a demand for fashion and textiles, and also there was trading. Um, but what happened at one point during this time period was that there was a whole bunch of sort of catastrophes and weather events and diseases, including the Black Plague, which really took out a lot of people, and it changed. There was a little bit of a shift in the structure yet again. So there was a population decrease because of famine and disease, and therefore the workforce was depleted, and wages went up due to a labor shortage. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the background. Let's talk about what people were wearing during this time. So here's sort of a summary. But basically, in the last century, we saw people wearing these really simple garments. So we talk about it being T-shaped because from the sleeves with the arms extended straight out, that looks like the top of the T, and then the body looks like the stem of the T. And this garment was one piece of fabric. So there's the body and the sleeves, and it's all connected, and then there's a little slit in the middle for the head. Now things are getting more complicated. So these are a full set of garments that were found on a what they call a bog body, and these were dated to about 1350 to 1370. Unfortunately, this person was, I think he was stabbed and then left for dead in the bog. But the good thing for us is that bogs do a great job of preserving things. The color is probably different, but we get to see a lot about what people were wearing during this time. The bog does dissolve some things like metals, but it leaves all the soft tissue intact, oddly enough. So these are ties that are tying these hose on, but we'll talk more about each of these pieces in the next few slides. So this guy was probably not a noble, so he was wearing something called homespun, which is basically cloth that is made not by like a skilled tradesman, but probably by one of the women in a household. And he had a cloak. All of his clothing were made out of wool, and it was a twill weave. So twill weave is similar to what we see in denim, where if you run your fingernails along it, it kind of makes a zipping noise because the fabric is woven in such a way that it creates these diagonal ridges. And the direction of the weaving can be switched so that it makes more of a herringbone pattern, like a zigzag, or it can make sort of this bird's eye pattern. But these are all twill weaves. So his cloak and all of his clothing, in fact, was made out of a wool fiber that was woven in a twill weave. So we have this tunic, so that the cloak that we just saw, that was on the very outermost part of his body. And then closer to his skin, we had a tunic or a coat. And later they would call this a chemise, and there'd be something else in between the cloak and the chemise. You can see that the sleeves are attached here by seams, and then we also have these triangular pieces underneath the arms to add movement. These are called gussets or gores. There's also these triangular shaped pieces in the bottom half of the garment that add fullness to this space and then allow them to walk or to ride a horse. And then also there's this circular shape now for the neck instead of being just a straight slit. This is the thing sort of deconstructed, but this same shape would have also been a surcoat for this kind of a garment. So here's the hole for the head, and then you can see it's spliced on the sides and spliced in the middle, and that's where these triangular shapes or these gores or gussets would have been inserted. And there's a whole bunch of configurations of these kinds of things. Sometimes they're gathered up here at the top, so they're even fuller down here, meaning like the fabric is scrunched up or pleated or cinched up and then stitched into these slits. So this allows the thing to open up. And then you might be able to see there's like a little variation in color right here where a belt would have been worn around the waist of this garment. He also had a hood, sort of a hooded cape with the liripipe, which is that long tubular piece of fabric that hung off the back. Here's the hose, which were still the woven fabric that were tied around the knee area. And then he had some leather items. These look like they're for sheaths for two different kinds of knives. One was probably for hunting, and one maybe for food. And then he had this bag, here it is upside down, for carrying other items. And then he had various other little leather pieces for hooking things on. Here's his shoes, and these are his belts and another tie for holding things together. One for actually holding his garment and one for holding his knife and his purse and everything. So peasant clothing was relatively simple, homespun, like I said, things that were woven at home rather than by a skilled craftsperson, and we'll talk more about that later. And they would wear a belt at the waist, stockings for cold weather, they'll have a cloak and maybe some clogs, or if it's muddy out, they might wear boots. And maybe the clogs underneath the boots if they're lucky, because that would keep them out of the mud and keep the water from seeping into their probably leather or fabric shoes. They would have a hat, like you can see here, to shade them from the sun and or to keep their head warm. And then women would wear something similar, but instead of wearing hose, they'd wear a longer gown or a dress. The garments that they wore, if they were terribly poor, would be just whatever the natural color of the fiber was, but they would try and dye things in colors. And one of the easiest to get a hold of dyes was a blue dye called woad. So again, this is sort of different scenes. A lot of times you'll see it's sort of a historical context, like a biblical story or something, but everybody's dressed in the time, the garment of the times during which the painting was made. And some of the figures are just wearing like religious ceremonial outfits. But anyway, you can see here this guy's wearing a tunic or a chemise, and then you can see these guys have tights on and some boots. They have a longer sleeve, and the sleeves are kind of crunching up around the wrists. This is the new variation of the coif, and then this is something called a sugar loaf hat, which we'll talk more about. The garments are split to allow for movement, or else they're shorter. This is sort of a city scene, and you'll remember even as far back as Egyptian times, short garments were what the laborers wore, but they start to come into fashion for older people. This is sort of a dismal scene. It's a city scene, and there's like trade going on and war and ceremonial noble types, and then just bystanders and townspeople watching people getting hung and getting their heads chopped off and whatnot. And then these are some peasants. Oh, and you can see these guys are just wearing these shorter tunics, but the fashionable guys are wearing shorter tunics too. There's just a little bit of a different style spin on it, which we'll talk more about. And then these are women sort of farming and working in the field, and they're wearing these long gowns that usually cover their feet, and then aprons just to keep their clothes from getting messed up. The nobility or the richer people, landowners, they would party, and that was a good opportunity to show off fashion and really smart tailoring and expensive fabrics. And silk was cool, something that previously had been from foreign lands, but increasingly was being produced relatively locally. I just want to show here. Peacock feathers were also a popular fashion accessory, but here what they've done is they've cooked the bird, but they've left it sort of taxidermied in as part of the presentation for the food. So probably there was a real stuffed bird on the table. Just to show the exotic nature of the food. There's one nobleman who's noted for the way he and those in his kingdom dressed, and that was Philip the Bold. And he was in charge of Burgundy, and that's probably, well, not probably, that's where the name for the color burgundy came from, was from that region. Also, they had a particular wine from that area. And then they also called it scarlet. It was a dark red. It was very popular in that area. And he wore some really elaborate costumes. And so he and his court are often talked about in terms of fashion. They wrote about it. Apparently, their fashion was pretty outrageous. So here we have some noblewomen sitting here with some hennin, which are really tall hats. And hennin was sort of a mocking term, meaning to inconvenience. It was sort of sounded like the French word for inconvenience. And the hats could be up to 36 inches tall. And so there were some sumptuary laws, like we talked about in the last chapter, where the royals could wear the 36-inch tall hats, and then the noblewomen who were not royal had to wear shorter hats. And so the shorter your hat was, the less important you were. These are the sugar loaf hats again, and these guys are wearing houppelans, and she here has her gown, the edges are turned back. Those are called revers, and they're usually fur or contrasting fabric, and then that's mirrored on the cuffs. And then they wear these stiff belts around the busts, and we'll talk about these gowns too later. So again, hennin, usually with a veil sticking out of it. You see they have tall foreheads. They would pluck their foreheads to give that effect. Around this time, when kings are building their kingdoms and there's some warring going on as they're trying to maintain their land or take over other lands, on the battlefield, people are wearing, chainmail or suits of armor or whatever, and they need to be identified. So these kingdoms are sort of branding themselves, and they're coming up with crests and colors that are indicative of which side they're on. And sometimes they seem dissonant. So here we see something French, and then over here we see like the blue with the fleur-de-lis, and then on this side we see something that's maybe German. And what probably happened here is two families were married, and so the two livery, which is from the French, with livraison, which means to distribute. So in English, that became livery. So, and livery is basically the clothes that have the colors or the crest of a particular kingdom on them. And these would be passed out to people in the household, or sometimes to, like I said, to people on the battlefield, so that you could identify who they were from. So you can see the different houses or kingdoms being represented by the different liveries. So these are like shields with the livery, and then also like tableaux or something that they would wear over their coat of armor. And then here we have mi-parti, which is in the effort to differentiate themselves from other kingdoms, they started sewing things together. And like I said, it also came from two different kingdoms uniting, usually under marriage. So maybe one of the families was red and one was green, and the two got married, and so that household became half red, half green. And here we have red and blue. Here we have red and white. So that mi-parti is like when one leg is red and one leg is green, or one leg is, one arm is white and one arm is red. So it's when they take the two different colors and they put them together. To us, it looks maybe kind of like a jester or something. So I talked earlier about merchants under this new organization for society where there was more trade and monetization of things. So you weren't just like a slave on the land who was, trying to produce things for the king, but you actually needed to trade and earn money somehow because you had to pay the king in money and you had to pay the rent for the land you were on. This created, this whole new economy. And so some of these successful tradesmen were earning more money and creating like a middle class. And they weren't really noble, but some of them were really rich. And a lot of them were definitely wealthier than a peasant, and they called these the bourgeoisie. So about fashion, because these bourgeoisie created a need for fashion, and then this new economy created all these trades for sale. So these are some farmers probably, or some tradespeople, and they're shearing the sheep or giving them a haircut because sheep's fur gets really big and gnarly and out of hand, and in order to stay healthy, they need a haircut. And serendipitously, wool is really useful. You can do all kinds of things with it. You can stuff things like pillows or mattresses or whatever. You can spin it into yarn and then weave it into fabric. You can do all kinds of things with wool. And as I said earlier, homespun refers to when they would take something like sheep's wool and then they'd twist it into yarns and then weave that into fabric. And it was usually pretty rough and not fancy, itchy instead of soft, and not really sumptuous. And it depends on how good they were at like carding and whatever, which is like cleaning and getting all the like the residue. Because sheep create lanolin, which is like a waxy kind of stuff that's good for the skin, but it doesn't make the fibers seem very fine. And then also, obviously, there's lots of like plant material all caught up in the curly sheep's wool, right? And carding is kind of like, well, combing and carding is sorting and getting all the stuff out of the fiber, all the impurities out to make it soft. And so here we see the way things had been done forever, which is with a distaff and a spindle. So this distaff is this long stick that they have sticking underneath their arm. And then on the top, they have the fibers, like the wool, that are wound around it and then tied with a ribbon. And then down at the bottom, they have this heavier thing called a spindle. And what they're doing is they're twisting the fibers together and creating yarn. And then the yarn gets wound around, basically a spindle or a spool. And then that gets used to weave fabric, which we'll talk about in a second. And so during this period, there was the advent of a new tool called a spinning wheel. And if you've ever seen Sleeping Beauty or heard that legend, there's a sharp needle on the spinning wheel, and that's what Sleeping Beauty pricks her finger on. So you can see here like a little pair of scissors on the ground, and you see the spinning wheel, and this is a bunch of probably sheep's wool, and she's twisting it, and this is the spinning wheel is assisting her in turning this into a yarn that can be used to weave fabric. And if you're interested in how this works, either this process or this process, you can go onto YouTube and just search distaff and spindle or spinning wheel. You can also research or search up weaving and looms, and you'll be able to see, like, hand looms is a good thing to search, and you'll be able to see people spinning and carding and weaving fabric, and you can see this whole process. So this was all done by hand, right? This is before machines, and a lot of times it was done by poorer families in house. And this was kind of a hobby, like a productive thing to do. You could weave it into cloth, like for chemises or dish towels or for sheets or all kinds of things. And then just a word about what they're wearing, right? So we have these sugar loaf hats. You can see the high foreheads where they pluck their hair so that they can have that effect. This is a young unmarried woman because her hair is exposed, right? Her hair is exposed. She's probably married because we can't see her hair, although it could be hiding behind her, like this one has it all tied up or plaited or braided. You see them wearing these gowns with these stiff belts and the revers, which are the edge of the gown, the V-neck turned back. And then this fur trim that they have at the neck is mirrored at the cuff and at the hem of the skirt. She's wearing a different kind of a gown. She's wearing an easier gown for working for housework, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So here we have someone using the distaff and spindle to spin. Here we have a woman working on a loom. She's obviously royalty, a princess or a queen. And so this is her shuttle. And so she's got the yarns that they're spinning. She's got the yarns tied to the loom. And then she's got another yarn woven through this shuttle, which she goes in and out and in and out and through these yarns that are tied. And then this here, this pulls it pulls the fabric back towards and like sort of smashes it. And down here you have petals that raise and lower the yarns. So I was saying earlier when I was talking about homespun, for a twill weave, for a plain weave you need every other yarn to go up and down. And for twill weaves and satin weaves and different weaves you need different yarns to go up and down. So these petals down here control the raising and the lifting of these yarns. Over here we have a woman making lace, what's called bobbin lace. So you can see that this is all things that are done in the home by women. And here's a whole bunch of other variations of looms, and then the textile trade, another loom here, more about tailoring and textile trade, another loom here, more textile trade and garment trade here. The putting out system, again, these merchants, they didn't do it all themselves. So they didn't like shave the sheep and spin the yarn, but all these tradespeople did do these things. So there was a guy who was really good at spinning a certain kind of yarn for a certain kind of thing, and a guy who was really good at weaving a certain kind of cloth for a certain kind of thing, whether it was the cloth for a working man's coat or the cloth for a rich person's chemise, or some people did velvet or brocades or whatever. So the trades guys had this whole supply chain, and so they might buy the fiber from one guy and then sell it to the guy who spins it into yarn, and then they'd either use that money or that credit to buy the yarn. So they'd sell them the fiber and buy the yarn, and then they take the yarn and take it to the person who weaves the cloth, and they'd sell them the yarn for the cloth, but then also buy the cloth, and then they take the cloth and sell it to the guy who maybe dyes the cloth, or the fuller who treats the surface of the cloth. And so they were buying and selling raw materials and getting things that were closer to being finished goods, and then ultimately they might sell it at a trade fair, or they might even take it to tailors. So there's all these specific trades, and they're even in the previous chapter, they had started to organize guilds of tradespeople where they would come up with standards and training and apprenticeships and ways to sort of certify your skill so that you could have evidence of your mastery of a certain expertise, a certain niche. So here's more images of trade. So, guys making deals and making trades and weighing things. And over here, like inspecting goods, and he's probably the king excising taxes on these tradespeople. So again, because of not just royalty, but these tradesmen and the whole new economy, there's a new need for certain kinds of richer, more luxurious fibers and cloths. So here we have an example of a cloth probably from about the 15th century. It might have been made someplace like Turkey. Again, there was a lot of trade, and then it would be imported to Europe. So where these cloths were made, sometimes they were really thick and they were intended for like home furnishings, like upholstery or pillows or carpets. But in colder areas of Europe, it would be made into clothing. So here's another example of it's got multiple colors and metallic threads and silk in it. It's got a pile, kind of like a velvet, so it's fuzzy in places, and it's brocaded. So it's a really fine, intricate textile. And here we see tailors measuring and sewing things, and they've got the cloth on the table and the scissors and little pieces cut out. And here we have another image of a tailor shop with people doing different things. So tailors underwent a really um, lengthy apprenticeship where they basically worked for free, and what they were getting in return was for a certain number of years, basically free labor. They got trained on how to be a tailor so they could go somewhere else and open up their own shop. Or sometimes they would take over the shop for the guy who was retiring. And then again, there were different niches. So tailors would become known for certain kinds of garments. So there was probably the guy who made the hose, and the guy who made the outer coat, and the guy who made the tunics underneath. And maybe it was less expensive. There was a guy who made the braids and the chemise and all kinds of things. So they were getting more and more specialized. There was also buttons, and buttons were made out of wood or bone or shell or metal, and all those were different techniques. So, like the metal button guy was probably also had training that was similar to that of a jeweler. And some of the innovations were if you grab a piece of fabric, like if you're in any other kind of a fashion class, like Fash1A perhaps, you have come into contact with a plain weave fabric like muslin. And if you tug on muslin in the lengthwise grain direction, so when we were looking at the looms, those would be the yarns that were tied to the loom that create the lengthwise grain. And then the yarn that's tied to the shuttle that goes back and forth, that's the crosswise grain. If you tug on that lengthwise or crosswise grain, there's no give to it. And that's how they were making hose. So in a lot of these images, you see the hose are tight fitting. That's probably just stylized because they didn't have anything that stretched. And so things really couldn't fit that closely and still allow for movement. So one of the things they figured out during this era was that if you didn't cut on the lengthwise grain and you didn't cut on the crosswise grain, but you cut things kind of sideways, we call that on the bias, that direction was more unstable and therefore it stretched. So they started cutting things like hose on the bias. And then we already talked about gores, so piecing things in those little triangular shapes, so the edges of those triangular shapes were on the bias. And so that allowed for fullness and movement and stretch. And then another thing they did was, we'll talk about more of it here actually, they started changing the way they put garments together. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So again, for peasants, the colors were more drab and the clothing was more utilitarian. What did you need in order to move and do your job? So here's some butchers. So they might be wearing leather aprons in order to protect themselves from their work. But the noble people, they were wearing more complex, more elaborate garments. So this is a pourpoint, which was worn in the second half of the 14th century by a French nobleman by the name of Charles of Bois. And in French it would be Dubois. And so this pourpoint, also called a doublet or a jupon, is a closely fitted garment. Sometimes they were sleeveless, and sometimes, like in the case of this one, they had sleeves. And they were also used, they were padded and they were used underneath armor as well as being outer garments. And you would wear these with a pair of long hose. So here you see probably a mom dressing a son who's passed away. And so he's got his chemise and his braids, and she's putting his jupon or his pourpoint or his doublet over his chemise, and she's going to get him dressed. And so you see all these little ties hanging off here. That's where they would tie their hose so that they didn't fall down, because they weren't stretchy with elastic waist like they have now. And you can see some of the complicated construction here. So we'll talk more about this in a minute. All these buttonholes and these buttons. We'll talk more about how that all worked in a little bit. So here is and some articles of dress that were attributed to Charles the Bold of Burgundy, and we talked earlier about how the fashion Burgundy was really like the height of fashion. They were really fancy over there. So this is a hat that he wore as a crown, and it's got this conical or pyramid-shaped ruby on top, and all these pearls and gold work and other precious gems. And here's a jacket that's attributed to him in that famous red or scarlet, and it's I think it's a velvet that is what it's made out of. So it has a pile, but it also has a sheen to it, and you can see how closely fitted it is in the body. So there's lots of seams and things that are happening to create all these 3D shapes. And then you see this sleeve shape. True, it's much more complex. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the old way, right? This T-shaped garment with a slit, and this is the new way. So instead of these sleeves being all part of the fabric, these sleeves are more complex shapes. They're what we call set-in sleeves. So here's the old tunic shape, and here's some other variations of old tunics, right? And here's the old tunic that we were looking at, and here is what that pourpoint was looking like, or the jupon, or the doublet. It's got like all these shapes cut out, and all this complex sewing to allow for movement of the arms, and also for like fitting the body and changing the shape of the body. So here's just the top half of what this would have looked like. So you see this complicated sleeve shape, right, for going over the shoulder and under the armpit, and then the shape of the waist, and then this is this poofy thing on top. Later we call this a leg of mutton sleeve, but we'll talk about that in another chapter. So here we have some guys wearing these pourpoints or doublet, or later in England they become doublets and then jackets, but they get shorter, right? So it's just barely covering the hip, and then they have these longer hose now that are bifurcated, more similar to tights now. And then here we have this other garment that's on top of like a coat or a closely fitting garment. And on top we have this houppelande. And it's fitted in the body, and then it's got a fuller skirt. And then this guy here has something called a corset, which is a cape that's open on one side. And this one is lined in fur, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This one's lined in fur too. We'll talk about furs in a minute. Here we have, what I'm trying to point out here is how these edges are scalloped or shaped. Over here we have scalloped or shaped. This is dagging. Here we have the cote tardie, which is similar to the jacket or the doublet, but it's less shaped. And they'll be sleeveless, or some of them have sleeves. You can see this has like a tippet or something hanging off the elbow, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here we have a houppelande, and then they have really exaggerated sleeves, right? Really exaggerated sleeves. And this one has really fancy dagging. And these houppelandes have these deep sort of tubular pleats or folds in the bottom half. And here we have a whole bunch of things going on. So here we have a longer houppelande with a belt. Here we have what's called a houppelande à mi-jambe, which means that it comes to about the calf. This houppelande has dagging on the sleeves and it has dagging along the sweep of the skirt. Here's another houppelande. Here's another houppelande with these full cape-like sleeves. Sometimes, let's see if we can find one. Yeah, sometimes you can see how this has an opening to allow for riding or for walking even. Let's see, so more dagging. This one has like binding going around the edges, which is more complex. You can see they have different colors of lining, contrast lining inside the sleeves or the skirts. So let's see, what else do we have here? So this is again that corset or round cape. This one has dagging. It's open on their right shoulder and then somehow pinned shut in various ways. So some more corsets here with different kinds of dagging, and then a houppelande mise en jambe, which is down to the middle of the calf. And then here's a shorter, this was probably called a doublet. I guess it could be a houppelande still because of the way it's pleated, but we have dagging and we have fur-lined sleeves. We also have dagging here at the neck. And then we have these tights, which extended all the way down. They'd have leather sewn into the bottom. And then here again, houppelande mise en jambe. So again, it's to the mid of the calf right here. And these are split open on the sides to allow for riding. You can see those deep tubular folds or pleats. Here we have an housse. This is a wide-skirted overcoat, and it had these little lapels that would fold back into these sort of round tongue shapes here. Here we have a chaperon, which is a hooded shoulder cape, and a lot of times it would still have the laripipe on it. So this one has dagging and a hood. He's got these long things hanging from his elbows, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here's another one of those hooded capes with the laripipe. Here, another hooded cape, hooded cape. Here's the Poulon or the Krakow again, depending on where you're from. So these pointy-toed shoes, they were in and out of fashion during this few hundred-year period. Here we have a woman wearing a sideless surcoat. So this white part is called a placard or a plaston, and then the skirt is attached to this. Underneath, she's wearing a coat. So she's got this close-fitted coat, and on top of it, she's got a sideless surcoat that shows off the coat underneath, and then she's got the plaston here, or a placard. And then down the middle, she's got these what look like buttons, but they're brooches or benzons, and they're decorative pieces here. You can see he's got the same action we have here, the housse. So he's got she's got the housse right here. They have the super long sleeves that are wrinkling at the wrist. We have the really big sleeves here that are fur lined. We have some dagging around the collar here. We have some ermine fur here, which means royalty. Here we have the housse again, and then we have a shorter houppelande here. The child is dressed just like the adult, which is kind of common. We have another houppelande back here that's belted up under the waist. Here we have another image of a sideless surcoat, and she's got the coat or gown underneath with the super duper long sleeves covering the arms. We have a plaston or placard down the center here to which the skirt is attached on the sideless surcoat, and we have the benzon coming down the center here. Another image of a sideless surcoat in person, and then sideless surcoats in art. Here's some more images of sideless surcoats. And then here's another image of a woman wearing a sideless surcoat. We have some dagging here. We have a fur-lined houppelande here. Then we have this longer, narrower tunic sleeve with this stuff hanging off the back. We'll talk about that here. So again, this narrower, longer tunic sleeve, and then the outer sleeve that would open up, and sometimes they ended in some kind of a small point, and sometimes they're fur-lined, as is depicted here. Here there's sort of a cape sleeve going on here that's lined in fur. And when they were like a separate piece, they were called usually tippets. And then when they're attached to the sleeve, sometimes they're called lappets. But lappets or tippets are these things that are hanging off their elbow at the end of the sleeve. And then he's wearing a cote tardie, and then he's wearing one of those chaperons, so like a dagged hooded cape. Here again we have lots of tippets, so hanging from their arms we have these tippets. They're wearing cote tardie. We have more tippets here. We have tippets or lappets here. We have fur lining here. We have these low belts. We have mi-parti hose. More of the chaperon hooded capes here. Here we have some fur-lined sleeves that are dagged. Here we have more fur-lined sleeves, and the whole houppelande here looks like it's fur-lined here too. More fur lining in these houppelandes. So in Europe, where it was cold, fur was really popular, and they had sumptuary laws about who could wear what kind of fur. Here we have an ermine. They're super cute. And they're built for hiding in the winter with their furs all white except for this little black tip on their tail, which was fascinating to the royals. And you'll see in a lot of the paintings and a lot of the imagery these stylized little black tipped tails in a lot of their garments. And they used all kinds of fur. So they used otter fur, beaver fur. When they could get it, they would use lynx, something called marten, fox fur, fawn, a lot of reference to gray squirrel. This is a coney. They'd also use rabbit fur, so any kind of fur they could get their hands on. And the softer and rarer, the better it was for royals, and probably the more sumptuary laws there were. Hairstyles in the early part of the century, they were wider, more than high. But you know how fashion kind of ebbs and flows, so it was wide and then high and then wide and then high. They would often braid their hair, which they called plating or plaited hair, and they would use it to frame their face a lot of the times, as you can see in these images here. They would often hide their hair under a net to try and contain it. So here we see an image of the guys from Burgundy wearing that scarlet red that was popular in that area, and then their ladies on the other side here. And you can see their hair, the married ladies have their hair tucked up in these veils. Some kind of fur here. I'm not exactly sure what that's depicting, but surely they have fur-lined coats. These guys have brown fur, could be fox, could be any number of things, and a lot of dagging, fur-lined dagging, and this fabric manipulation here, which is probably dagging turning into slashing, which we'll talk about in the next century. They were still wearing the fillet or chapelet or a crown or a coronet over a veil, which they were now calling a fret. So this might be a chapelet or a fillet or a crown or a coronet, depending on where they were. And they were narrower and wider, but always with this little veil or fret. So here, we rarely get to see what ladies are wearing on their feet because their skirts are usually covering their feet, but their footwear was pretty similar to men's, maybe a little more delicate. Women's stockings would end at their knees and they would tie it around their knee. So you can see here she's got her skirt lifted up so we could see the under tunic. We can see her berets. We can see her shoe with a little Mary Jane strap, although that's not what they called it at the time. Here we have an image of a slipper. You can see these little holes here that were used to lace or tie it on. Could have been with another leather strap, or it could have been with something prettier like a ribbon. Here are some images of the hose or stockings that they would have worn. This is a biblical scene, but instead of wearing the clothes that they would have worn in biblical times, they have the people in the scene wearing clothes from the times in which the image was painted. So this is the beheading of John the Baptist, and this is Salome, the queen who wanted John the Baptist's head, and the executioner here. So here you can see the executioner wearing a chemise or tunic, and then he's got, I don't know if it's, because I can't really tell the way it's tied around his waist, but maybe a pourpoint or a gibon or a doublet or a jacket tied around his waist. His hose, he has the garters under his knees or gaiters, but because he's got his hose untied from his doublet, they're pooling around his knees. You can see his poulants, which are more boot-shaped and not so pointy for this particular time period. She's wearing a sideless surcoat. It looks like it's probably velvet and fur-lined with some pearls here because she's a queen. She's got these long sleeves or tippets, and they're sort of wrapped around her arm, just either for fashion's sake or for practicality. And then we have some other people in this scene that are also wearing costume of this particular time period. So we've got some cotardie, we've got some hose, and we've got a sugarloaf hat here. This guy's wearing a coif. So we've got, and she's got her veil here over a more like a Turkish headdress. So again, the high forehead was popular, and they would pluck their hair to give themselves this high forehead look. Some people would dye their hair. Blonde was, it was rare, but it was popular. They were also interested in having good instead of foul breath, so they started inventing using more mouthwashes. They didn't invent it. Things come and go. People invent things, and then, civilizations get conquered or whatever, and technology gets forgotten and remembered and found again. So here's some images of different shoes from the time period. So this is probably from someone more noble. All this piercing work, probably from someone more noble. Here's some decoration here. And it was probably like a slingback kind of an action, possibly. Here's some boots, probably for traveling or for a soldier or a laborer. Again, this garment that covers the upper body for men, it goes through a series of changes in name. The name is also different in different parts of the world. So the houppelande, it gets shorter. It barely covers the hips. You can see it's not even covering his backside here. Here it's a little longer. And here we have an even longer one. And here we have a coat over top, or a surcoat. And here we have like a tabard or a cloak or something over top. But England, they started calling this a jacket, and they stopped using the word cotardie. They were still using the name pourpoint, but in England they were calling it a jacket. And the use was similar. It was a suit jacket, and they would wear it with hose. As you can see, these are hose. Here's some mi-parti hose, more hose, instead of pants. And again, the more popular for the younger people, it was barely covering the hips. So again, the hose are what people were wearing, or men were wearing. The women were still just up to their knees because again, this is the John the Baptist scene where Queen Salome asked for his head on a platter. So it's a biblical scene, but it's being set by the artist in the times in which he painted it, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of the mid-1400s. And this is set in the Netherlands. So again, we see sort of the sugar loaf kind of hat. We see the hoopland or jacket, and it's fur lined and it's short, and we see these tights or hose, and they go all the way up to the waist, and they're tied up at the waist. But they're also sewn together, you can see, in the crotch area. They also, what starts coming into prominence is this thing called a cod piece, and that just gets out of control in the next century too. So here's an image of a cod piece, and it's this section for in men's garments that's like laced onto the tights. This is a later image, but we'll see more of this in the next chapter. But this has a whole bunch of things that are being talked about in this chapter, including the shorter jacket, the cod piece, and these little metal pieces, which I have zoomed in here. They're called tippets, and they are these metal pieces that they put on the ends of ribbon or leather laces. It's decorative, and it also allows them to get through the eyelets to hold things on. And here you can kind of see how the laces are holding the cod piece onto his tights. An ook is this the evolution of the tabard, and it's a cloak or a coat that's worn over top, often slit up the sides and sometimes up the center for riding. Pattens are these wood clogs that you would slide over your shoes to keep your shoes dry. Is there something else I forgot to tell you about? Yeah, I think we're good. Something about accessories. They would wear necklaces and brooches, obviously. The haircuts that were popular are something that historians were calling either a bowl crop, because it looked like someone put a bowl on their head and then trimmed around the edge, or a page boy cut, which is longer along the sides, and then there's often, not always, but often bangs in the front. Here we have some guys with some page boy cuts and some sugar loaf hats. They're wearing their tights and their shorter houppelans or jackets. Undergarments, we know for men they were wearing berets. They have found evidence of undergarments for women. We know just about everybody wore chemise, man or woman. But in Innsbruck, they found these, in a castle, they found evidence of what look like the modern predecessors to what we would now wear, like bralettes or brassieres. And then they also found written descriptions of things that were called like shirts with bags. So probably a lot like kind of similar to what they did with the cod pieces. They may have shaped the chemise to accommodate the bust, and then maybe tied underneath the bust for support, or to keep them sort of like foundation garments, to keep things in places that were attractive for the time. So here we see a woman, and she's got her surcoat that she's pulling off, or it could be her coat, we're not really sure, but underneath she's got a chemise or a smock or a shift. And here we see those chemises, smocks, or shifts being sewn by a tailor. And here we see a chemise, a smock, or a shift, depending on where in the world you're coming from. We see one being, or some detail of an older one with bobbin lace, insets, and decorations here. So this was a finer smock or chemise or shift. And that was worn closest to the body underneath everything. They started calling dresses for women, they started calling them gowns. The French still called them a cote, and they had two different spellings for it, C-O-T-E and C-O-T-T-E, but the English started calling it a gown. And usually there were two gowns, one over the other, and there would still be a chemise under that. There were also still like the cote hardie with hanging or long sleeves or tippets or narrow extensions. A lot of times when it was cold, these would be lined with fur. Um, in France, they would have a lot more open neckline, and in England, the necklines you can see here. This has a ruff, and it comes way up here, and you can see all these deep folds that they have, and this big, gorgeous belt that she's got around her waist. Um, and then here, this is an engagement or a bridal scene, and you can see that the bride is wearing a lower necked gown, and here she's wearing a lower necked gown too. And you can see um, uh, this woman is wearing a cote-hardie with really long sleeves, right? And here we can see the long sleeves is here as well. Um, and this is more of a houppelande. And then, yeah, and this is made out of a brocade. It's stone, it's a statue, but they're trying to show the ermine fur lining in here, and which might be happening here too. Here we have the V-necked gown, and the outer edge of that V-neck is folded back, and then there's a modesty panel inside, and then again these contrast revers are lined in something, often fur, which is mirrored in the cuffs and often the hem. And then again, so we have revers, modesty panel, revers, modesty panel, much more open neckline, a more closed neckline, a more open neckline. So she has the most open neckline. You also notice these headdresses. We'll talk more about them, how they're bifurcated, kind of like horns. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So again, a whole bunch of images of revers and how the trim is echoed in the other trim. He's got that corset that opens on one side, the cape that opens on one side. You can kind of see the codpiece and the hose and the poulon. They have a stiff, tight belt, so a stiff, wide belt that pulls everything together. Hers looks like it's some sort of metallic braid. Hers looks like it might be leather, might be a brocade. Hers could be leather or brocade. This one looks like it might be leather. This one looks like it might be leather with some metal detail. Here's a very fashionable royal person with a plucked hairline. She's got that bifurcated headdress with a fine veil or a fret over top. Her revers are folded back to reveal probably an ermine fur. She's got the wide belt. Her gown is made out of a brocade fabric with a metallic detail in it. A very popular motif during this time is the artichoke, which it looks like is in her gown. She's got a necklace, and she's also, I don't know if you saw, she also has some rings on, and the rings are worn down close to the hand and then also on the ends there, on the end of the finger. So again, revers here, lots of revers and necklaces. We've got some hennin with frets or veils, plucked hairlines. We've got a shorter hat here, which means that she's not as important as these ladies with the big elaborate hats and veils. Here we have a fuller gown that's called a frock or a rock. So it's not belted and it's looser. We also have some symbolism with colors during this time. So certain colors mean certain things forever. You know, like purple has always been royal. Now we're seeing red is a popular color for a wedding. So this is an engagement photo. You can see she's not yet married, so her hair is down and exposed. And she's wearing red, which is the color of a bride. And these women are married, so their hair is tied back, or they're likely married anyway. And they're wearing these netted caps that are called cauls. Sometimes they're visible and sometimes not. Their headdresses, some of the headdresses are bifurcated and kind of look like horns. And again, these high, bare foreheads are popular, so they pluck their hair. So whereas red is symbolic of a lot of things like birth and vitality, rebirth, weddings, hope. Black is also the symbol for mourning, and widows would wear black for a certain period of time. It depended. Um, Sometimes for the rest of their lives, they would wear drab colors. But mothers, if they lost a son, might only wear dark colors for a few months. It depended. Um, so they were still wearing a bit of chainmail. You can see here he's got it in his lower half. But they're also doing something they call a coat of plates. So you can see here it's like a combination of leather and metal. So they still were wearing the chainmail, but they were also wearing this coat of plates. And you can see he's got this belt with this sheath for his sword, which is held on by links of chain and metal. You can see these metal rivets here. And so they're put together very elaborately with metal and fabric and leather to allow for more movement and better fitting the body, but still protection against weapons. So he's got a helmet here, and the shape of this is kind of like a skull cap, and it straps on with leather straps under the chin. This was a good image that showed some of the parts that they talk about for a knight. So he's got his brace, over which he would have had his hose. Underneath here we see this white thing. We could assume that's probably a chemise. And then this thing that looks a lot like a pourpoint or a gibon, but it could also be, at this point, a capuchon, which is a padded, like a pourpoint, that you would wear over your chemise but under your suit of armor. And you might wear some chainmail over that, because a chainmail is pinchy and can like get your skin and your little body hairs, which would be very uncomfortable. Over here we have his suit of armor and probably a helmet. And here we have some gloves or gauntlets. And then here we have probably his surcoat, which probably had his the colors or the livery that would note what side he was fighting on. Here we have an image of probably a royal, and he's sitting on his suit of armor, and we can see these shin guards that would have protected the front of his leg here, and he's got his hand on his helmet, which looks like it was lined in probably velvet. And then he's got like his tablier on top, or this article of clothing that could either protect him under his armor or could go on top. And then this guy's got his mi-parti hose. He's got hose that come up to the knees, but he's also got another pair of hose that extend all the way up. And you can see these more complicated sleeves too, which we'll talk about in a minute. Here we've got this gambejon underneath, which is the padded garment. And then on top we've got the chainmail, which is called a hauberk or a haubergeon. And then here you can see the padded garment and some hose. And this guy's holding, or a little kid that's dressed just like an adult, is holding the helmet and the armor that this guy was probably wearing. And here we have the full-on suit of armor, and we can see people wearing suits of armor. They're articulated to allow for movement, but they're metal to allow for protection of the body. And you can see how older helmets were square, and later they changed the style, whether it was for strength or technical skill or aesthetics or all of the above, to have these rounder helmets. And they would have these face plates that could come down to protect the face and the neck and the jaw and the shoulders and everything. So you can still move, but you're protected from head to toe. And then the chainmail in here for while you're riding or walking, so you can still move. Super heavy. You had to be super strong. And then on top of it, you had to wield weapons and rams and all kinds of heavy things, and control your horse. And then on top they would have the livery that would explain where you're from, which kingdom you belong to. So, whole mess of stuff. We'll talk more about this later. This is from a different century, or it's more Renaissance. But just the point is the tailoring gets more complex, the detail gets more complex, the names start to change. Here you can see these ribbons that have the metal tippets on it. So you can see a nice detail, the metal tippet silk ribbon. This is metallic thread that's wound around another silk thread. This is a silk velvet. It's lined on the inside. It's got all these handmade buttonholes. You have all these extra seams. Like, things just start to get very complicated. That dagging is getting very complex with all these trims. So I think we talked about most of the things for the 15th century. Your book has some lists and some visual aids, right? So, like, these aren't primary sources, they're an artist's rendition, an interpretation of how things looked, just to make it easier for you to make out than it is in these pictures. So again, this is an image of like the gown that doesn't have a belt, it's fuller. That's the rock that later becomes the frock. And she's got her skirt lifted, so she's got another elaborate gown underneath there. And yeah, so we can see he's older fashion, so he's got the surcoat or the houppelande on top. So here we have some garments that, like, there's a lot of garments that are ceremonial and they mean something in society. So there's the sumptuary laws about who can wear what color and how tall your hennin can be and how long your poulant can be. But also there's a specific kind of dress for students, and then there's rite of passage dresses. So when boys are young, they might wear skirts, and when they get older, they get to wear bifurcated garments. So there's these, and like young women can have their hair uncovered, but then once you're married or at a certain station in life, you have to cover it. So you see these young boys have their hair uncovered. These older students have their, like university students, their hair isn't as long and unruly, and it's cut in a page boy cut, and they're wearing these special hats. So there's all this ceremonial dress that means something. So again, your book has visual aids, things that are diagrammed for you. So what's often hard to tell from images that artists have drawn for you, so you get a better idea of what's going on. So some of the headdresses are supported on the inside with stuffing, and others have sort of an exoskeleton where it's like metal on the outside. And like the hennin, its stability just comes from its shape, right? So these diagrams explain some of that. So these are good to look at to have a better understanding. And then they sort of give you a visual timeline, and then also let you know, like, not just the timeline, but where and what status people were. You know, so when you look at these paintings, there's mixed groups sometimes, and the clothing gives you an indication of what station a person was, whether they were clergy or royalty or lady in waiting or somebody important's child. So these, while they're not primary, they just serve to explain better what's going on in the images you see. And then for your visual, illustrated, digital vocabulary list, these are a list of the terms that you could use. Some of them really lend themselves to being defined visually, and some don't. So the putting out system maybe doesn't lend itself so well to being explained visually. But like the sugar loaf hat might, because you can find a picture of someone wearing a sugar loaf, and then you can also find an image like from some painting of merchants that shows how sugar was sold. That would explain that shape. And so a lot of these are easy to explain. You saw how I explained in my PowerPoint the difference between the set-in sleeve and the not set-in sleeve. So some of these really lend themselves to being explained visually, and some don't. So that takes us then from chapter 6 into chapter 7. So I'll see you there. Don't forget to do your your what is it, HCIDVL or whatever, the History of Costume Illustrated Digital Vocabulary List, and your Fashion Influence, where you show how something modern resembles something from this time period, how history has influenced now. And remember, when you do your fashion influence, that you want to show something historical, but the modern thing that you show, it should be something that people are just wearing on the street. It shouldn't be a costume or something that's strictly for the runway. It should be something that you see on the street. Like an obvious one might be like the chaperone and the hoodie, something like that. Um, and then also for your historical garments, always make sure that you're really looking at something historical, right? So this book, it's a valid source of information, but this is not a primary source. These drawings were not created during the period. You can use these, but you must also use something that was created during the period. So make sure that you have at least one source of something that was created during the period, and make sure you're getting it from someplace valid, someplace that we can count on for accuracy, not like Pinterest. Pinterest, we have no idea where that stuff came from. It may or may not be valid. So you have to search it back to the source. A valid source is your textbook. A valid source is a museum. A valid source is oftentimes a university. So Wikipedia, not a valid source, but it's a good jumping off point that you could follow things to the source. You can also go to the library and open up a book and take a picture with your phone. That's a valid source. So just make sure that your sources are valid and make sure that your sources are primary. With the modern fashion, not so important. Just make sure that it's something that people are actually wearing. So I think that's all. I'll see you in chapter 7.